What if the most dangerous strategy in war is not to win, but to make sure the other side can never stop paying? That is the paradox at the heart of Iran's behavior, and once you see it, the whole map changes. Because the usual question, can Iran defeat the United States, Israel, or a regional coalition in a direct conventional war, is the wrong question from the very beginning. Iran does not need to produce a clean battlefield victory. It does not need to plant a flag over someone else's capital. It does not even need to prove that it is stronger. It only needs to keep the game going long enough that stronger powers begin to feel weaker inside their own political systems. That is the real thesis here. Iran's strategy is not built around decisive triumph. It is built around managed endurance, dispersed pressure, and the weaponization of time. And that is why so many observers misunderstand it. They keep measuring Iran against the standards of a conventional power when Iran behaves more like a systems strategist. It looks at the battlefield and asks a colder question: where are my enemy's hidden costs, and how do I keep them alive? Reuters put it bluntly in March, describing Iran's approach as a wager that it can outlast the United States and Israel not militarily, but by turning conflict into a brutal contest of endurance, using missiles, drones, and disruption of energy routes to jolt global markets hard enough to test Washington's political will. Even more revealing was the line buried inside that analysis. For Tehran, survival alone would be enough. Think about what that means. If survival counts as success, then every day the war continues becomes a political argument in Iran's favor, because the burden shifts from proving victory to proving durability. The military layer is the first place where this hidden logic becomes visible. Iran knows it cannot reliably dominate a superior coalition in a symmetrical contest, so it does not play symmetrically. It stretches the battlefield across missiles, drones, proxies, maritime threats, infrastructure vulnerability, and strategic depth. This is not just improvisation, it is a design. CSIS described Iran's escalation strategy as an effort to impose enormous costs on the United States, the region, and the world in order to dissuade future attacks. Notice the architecture of that sentence. The goal is not conquest. The goal is cost imposition. Iran escalates horizontally by widening the geography of conflict and vertically by expanding the types of targets that can be threatened. That means the battlefield is never just Gaza or Lebanon or Iraq or the Gulf. The battlefield becomes the entire decision space of the adversary. If your enemy must defend bases, cities, ships, oil infrastructure, sea lanes, airspace, and political legitimacy all at once, then your relative weakness begins to matter less. This is where the strategy becomes dangerous. Iran does not defeat stronger opponents by matching their strength. It defeats their concentration by multiplying their obligations. But here's the real problem. People still imagine proxy warfare as a side tool, when for Iran, it is closer to the central operating system. Tehran's regional armed network was not built merely to expand influence. It was built to fragment retaliation, distribute risk, and create a buffer between action and accountability. CFR's description is crucial here. Acting through proxies lets Iran endorse actions without always having to absorb direct retaliation for them. That is not a minor tactical benefit. That is strategic insulation. If a militia in Iraq attacks a U.S. position, if Hezbollah pressures Israel from the north, if the Houthis disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, Iran changes the geometry of response. The stronger power now faces a choice: escalate against the local actor, escalate against Iran directly, or absorb the pressure and keep managing it. Every option carries cost, every option consumes bandwidth, and every option helps Iran preserve the one thing it values most in a long confrontation: ambiguity. Ambiguity is not confusion, it is room to maneuver. And room to maneuver is exactly what a weaker but more flexible state needs when facing stronger enemies. Now move to the political layer, because this is where endurance becomes a weapon. Democracies and coalition systems are vulnerable in a way authoritarian strategic cultures often study very carefully. They must justify time, money, and risk repeatedly. They must explain why the next strike matters, why the next deployment matters, why the next rise in oil prices matters, why the next shipping escort is still worth it. Iran understands that if the conflict becomes prolonged, the contest slowly migrates out of missile ranges and into television studios, parliaments, election cycles, insurance markets, and public fatigue. Reuters reporting on Washington's own reversals is illuminating here. In April, Reuters argued that President Trump's abrupt reversal on Iran exposed the limits of American leverage, especially when maximalist threats collided with market stress, energy disruption, and political costs. You do not have to agree with every interpretation of that moment to understand the larger strategic signal. Iran does not need to convince Washington that it is unbeatable. It only needs to remind Washington that everything has a price, and that prices accumulate faster in open political systems than many military planners admit. Think about what this means. In a long game, the side that suffers visible damage is not always the side that is losing. Sometimes the more dangerous loss is invisible. Credibility erosion, domestic impatience, coalition stress, rising insurance costs, nervous markets, and leaders who begin searching for an exit they can sell as a victory. Source. And then comes the economic layer, which may be the real center of gravity. Iran sits near one of the world's most strategically sensitive energy choke points for a reason that is almost too obvious to notice. Geography can compensate for weakness when it intersects with global dependence. Reuters reported in March that Western efforts to secure Red Sea shipping had already consumed more than $1 billion in weapons, still resulted in ships being sunk, and ended with shippers largely avoiding the route. Experts quoted by Reuters called that campaign a tactical and operational victory, but a strategic draw, if not a strategic defeat. That phrase should alarm every serious strategist. Why? Because it reveals the asymmetry at the heart of maritime coercion. The defender can intercept, the defender can escort, the defender can spend more, but if commercial traffic still reroutes, if insurers still panic, if energy prices still spike, then the strategic effect may still favor the disruptor. This is where the strategy becomes dangerous. Iran and its aligned actors do not need to fully close a sea lane forever. They only need to make normal commerce feel abnormal. They only need to create a tax on predictability. And once that happens, every tanker captain, every shipping firm, every energy trader, and every government begins calculating around fear. In that environment, even partial disruption becomes power. Reuters also noted that protecting Hormuz would be harder than protecting the Red Sea, given Iran's more formidable capabilities, coastal geography, missiles, drones, mines, and swarm tactics. In other words, Iran's leverage is not based only on what it destroys, it is based on what it can make the world imagine. The Houthis are the perfect case study in how this logic works at the psychological and systemic level. Reuters reported that the group had launched more than 100 attacks on shipping from late 2023 onward, and later made clear they would not simply dial down under pressure. What matters here is not whether the Houthis are puppets in the simplistic sense. Reuters itself noted that Iran says the group acts independently while still being Iran-aligned. That ambiguity is precisely the point. Strategically useful actors are often most useful when they are aligned enough to create pressure, but autonomous enough to complicate attribution and control. The result is a pressure ecosystem rather than a neat chain of command. And that ecosystem forces adversaries into a losing administrative rhythm. Intercept, condemn, escort, sanction, warn, redeploy, repeat. Iran does not need every proxy move to be perfectly controlled to benefit from the system. It only needs the system to keep producing friction. This is where the strategy stops looking like a series of isolated crises and starts looking like a machine. One front drains air defense, another front drains shipping confidence, another front raises the risk premium on regional investment, another front strains alliance coordination, another front tests escalation thresholds. None of these actions alone wins the game. Together they keep the game expensive. Source. Everyone thinks this is about Iran proving strength, But the turning point is realizing it is actually about making stronger players prove patience. That is a very different contest. In classical strategy, decisive battles are supposed to settle questions. In Iran's preferred environment, unsettled questions are more valuable. Uncertainty is an asset. Repetition is an asset. Delay is an asset. Because every week without resolution creates more opportunities for strategic leakage on the other side. More economic friction, more political argument, more media fatigue, more regional nervousness, more pressure on allies to stay neutral, more temptation for great powers to seek off-ramps rather than outcomes. That is why Iran doesn't need to win in the cinematic sense. It needs to keep the board from clearing. It needs to keep every opponent partially mobilized, partially alarmed, partially committed, and fully unable to leave. This is a deeply game-theoretic strategy. If your enemy has greater resources but a lower tolerance for endless cost, then the rational play is not to destroy him quickly. The rational play is to trap him in a sequence of moves where every answer carries a penalty and every pause looks like weakness. That is not glorious. It is not even always visible, but it is brutally intelligent. So what comes next? Not prophecy, logic. If Iran continues to follow this model, then we should expect more multi-domain pressure rather than a simple sprint to direct conventional showdown, more calibrated use of proxies and aligned actors, more threats to shipping and energy arteries because they amplify global attention and economic spillover, more attempts to widen the consequences of local military action into regional or even international costs, more emphasis on survival narratives inside Iran, because regime cohesion depends on redefining endurance as victory, and more effort to convince adversaries that escalation will not solve the problem, only enlarge it. That last part matters most. If Iran can persuade stronger powers that every attempt to finish the problem merely redistributes the problem across more fronts, then it has already achieved a kind of deterrence through entanglement. Not peace, not safety, but a strategic environment in which no one can cleanly win without paying more than they expected. Source. And here is the biggest insight of all, the one most people miss because they are still looking for spectacular victories. In the modern Middle East, and increasingly in world politics, power is not only the ability to destroy, it is the ability to prolong. It is the ability to deny closure. It is the ability to transform your own vulnerability into a permanent management problem for your enemy. Iran's hidden strength is not that it can overpower the system. It is that it can infect the system with cost, delay, and uncertainty. Think about what this means. A weaker actor that cannot dominate the battlefield may still dominate the tempo of exhaustion. And once exhaustion becomes the true battleground, military superiority becomes only one variable among many. Elections matter, fuel prices matter, insurance rates matter, public attention spans matter, coalition patience matters. This is not just a lesson about Iran. It is a lesson about how conflict works when the battlefield is fused with media, finance, maritime trade, and political psychology. The side that keeps the game going is not always desperate. Sometimes it is playing the only game it ever intended to play. So the conclusion is darker than it first appears. Iran does not need a parade. It does not need a surrender ceremony. It does not need to look stronger than America, or richer than the Gulf, or more technologically advanced than Israel. It only needs one thing: for all of them to remain trapped in a cycle where every move costs more than standing still, and standing still costs more than they can comfortably admit. That is the revelation. Iran doesn't need to win. It just needs you to keep playing. And the question that should start the real debate is this: in a conflict where survival counts as victory and endless cost counts as leverage, who is actually trapping whom?